All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We're very excited about this webinar. It is part of the Unpacking Coaching Webinar series presented by the National Center for Pyramid Model Innovations. I'm Mary Louise Himmeter, and I'm going to be your host. Today's topic is coaching conversations, motivational interviewing to support provider wellness and engagement. And I think these are topics that a lot of people have been asking a lot of questions about. So I think this is a very timely webinar, and we're really excited that you're joining us. So I am just thrilled to have Amy and Julia with us today. And so I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Julia.
Thank you so much, Mary Louise. I am just delighted looking at everyone introducing themselves in the chat and seeing where everyone is calling in from, tuning in from. I am Julia Sales. I am a licensed mental health clinician by training. I have spent my entire career in infant and early childhood mental health, and I am an assistant professor at Georgetown University and also support NCPMI, thinking about mental health, trauma-informed care, and also well-being. And I'll pass it over to Amy.
Thanks so much, Julia and Mary Louise. I couldn't be more pleased with the crew that we have here today. So what expertise between Julia and Mary Louise. I'm Amy Hunter. I am also an assistant professor at Georgetown University and also on faculty at NCPMI. And wow, it's so fun to see all of you joining in, saying hello from all over the country. That's really encouraging to see interest in pyramid everywhere. I am a social worker by training and certainly bring that lens to the work. And why don't we go ahead and get started? Before we do, I want to encourage all of you to make this interactive. And it seems like we don't have to tell you that from the way that you're saying hello. So keep it coming. You know, as you have questions, as we're talking, we want to respond to your questions to make this as meaningful as possible. We have a relatively short time and we could talk about this forever. So ask your questions and we will try to be as responsive as possible. So let's jump in. These are the learning objectives that we imagined you would, reasons you would come and what you would get out of this. So we hope you'd learn a little bit more about provider well-being, or often referred to as staff wellness. We probably don't have to talk to you all about this. My guess is you could share a lot about this with us, but we will present a little bit of the most recent research that is pretty interesting. We'll talk about how motivational interviewing skills can be used in all types of conversations that you have, and how those motivational interviewing skills can be used to help related to staff wellness and provider well-being. We're going to try to weave in both talking about educators or early childhood centers and classrooms and teachers, as well as appropriate strategies to use this work in early intervention. So whether you're coaching teachers or whether you're coaching interventionists, we hope that you'll find these strategies can be helpful in your work. And we're going to try to use a couple of real life scenarios from our experience with this. So those are our objectives. Why don't we go to the next slide? And I hope all of you are very familiar with this framework. How does motivational interviewing fit in this framework? It could fit at every single level, right? Right now we're sort of focusing on coaching. And so in a way, we're talking about building professional development related to your own coaching capacity, but then how you as a coach build the capacity of the folks that you work with. So in a way, we could say, oh, this is the yellow, it's effective workforce. But really, the strategies that we're talking about here can be used at every level of the pyramid. So whether you're talking with a teacher about individualized intervention at the top of the pyramid, you could use these strategies. Really, no matter what level of the pyramid you're focused on, these strategies, we believe, can help you in your conversations to be more relationship-based and more effective. We can move to the next slide. And I'm going to transition it over to Julia, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about what we've learned recently about provider well-being.
Sure. So people may be familiar with this new data that has recently come out of a pretty huge number N, right? So over 25,000, well, what we saw, sorry, let me back up just one second. What we saw is over 25,000 educators, early childhood practitioners were polled in sort of a longitudinal study. And out of that 25,000 people, over 3,000 people had left the field in the span of just under 3 years. And so they started to think about why are people leaving the field? And I'm sure the top 4 bullets here are no surprise to anyone. We know the first thing that practitioners identified was low pay, right? So 54% of the people who left the field said, I'm just not making enough money, I'm not making ends meet. But I think that the next 3 were really, really interesting and really things that to me are deeply connected to motivational interviewing, are deeply connected to staff wellness and staff well-being and collective well-being. So the second bullet or second reason for leaving the field was not enough respect. And so 39% of folks who left the field identified this as the reason for leaving. Lack of benefits, 35% of the people polled identified this for the reason of leaving. And then our coming in fourth, we had 34% of people said that they didn't have enough support for challenging behaviors. And that is what led them to leave the field. So again, always interesting to see longitudinal data coming out of the field. This comes out of Walter Gilliam's work. And he went a little further too, right? So he said, okay, well, let's dig into that report of challenging behavior and let's think about what teachers reported seeing in 2021. And then we're going to go back and we're going to ask them again in 2023. And so you can see this bar graph that in every single one of these pre-2021 to post-2023, we saw an increase in the teacher report of challenging behaviors. And there was 3 different categories. So the first set of bars was looking at externalizing behaviors, hitting, biting, scratching, all those things, right, that we can see as an externalized behavior. The second category was really looking at internalized behaviors. So that might be some more of that withdrawn, some more of that internal big experience that young children might have that might also be categorized as behavior that's challenging. And then last but not least is a subset that we don't always talk that much about, but it was somatizing. So this is really thinking about how big feelings, intense feelings show up in the physical experience and things like stomach aches, headaches, school refusal, factors like that. So we can see that if you look at the red, we have half or more. The teachers reported that half or more of these challenging behaviors were occurring. So we can see we jump pretty significantly in each of these categories in the red. And then we said the black area or the navy blue area said a few more. They're noticing a few more behaviors. And we see here like the externalizing, we actually went down just a little bit in that blue area. But the big piece here is that whether there really are more challenging behaviors or not, the perception from staff is that there are more behaviors that are occurring. And we know that when we are dealing with persistent behaviors, oftentimes that increases adult stress level. So we want to think about that. We know that early childhood practitioners oftentimes have a really high demand. You need to keep kids safe. You need to teach kids. You need to promote social emotional competencies. You need to open lunch boxes. You need to pat backs at rest time. You need to work with families, right? There's so many different roles that early childhood practitioners play in any given day. And so there's a very high demand placed on practitioners. We pair that with having low control. So oftentimes we might say, if I could just do it this way, it would make so much more sense. Or if I could do it this way, it would feel much better for me. Or I know it would work better for this family or for this classroom or for this home visit. But oftentimes we don't get to control that, right? We're following rules, we're following regulations, we're following systems that have been set up. So we have a very high demand, we have low control, and when we add these together, it really equates to having high levels of stress, right? So we're asking a whole lot, we're not giving a lot of control, and so people in this system are working really hard to make it work, and oftentimes they're doing that at the detriment of their own bodies, their own mental health, their own stress level, and they're doing a beautiful job at it, and we know it oftentimes doesn't feel very good for the provider in those moments. So we want to talk a little bit today and ground some of our conversation in this idea of community care. And we think that motivational interviewing can really support community care. We talk a lot about self-care. We talk a lot about individual strategies for wellness, but we don't always talk as much about this idea of community care. And the really big piece behind community care is thinking about this idea that when we all come together, when we are supporting one another as a group, we are stronger, right? We are better able to support every single person in our group, especially those people who may be coming with more stressors. We know that when we are engaged in community care, we're better able to think about how resources are distributed, how they might be redistributed, how we might offer or lend support when we're able to, how we accept support when we're able to or when we need it. And overall, we really land in this place of the idea of being in relationships with one another, the idea of supporting one another, the idea of being able to be empathetic and to show up for other people's experiences. That actually isn't the part that is stressful. That's not the part that fatigues us. That oftentimes can actually fill us up. It can give us a sense of purpose. It can give us a sense of belonging. And those are things that can fuel us, especially through really difficult times or those rough patches where we're saying, I feel so overwhelmed. The system feels so overwhelmed. I'm not even sure how we get ourselves out of this. Thinking about community care, thinking about compassion and relationships, and hopefully we will share some motivational interviewing strategies to help think about how we have these conversations can really support us in being able to move forward. So we wanted to give you a little, hopefully, burst of wellness. This comes from Dr. Vilma Reyes, and once she presented it, it really stuck with me, and we thought it would be a great opportunity to share with you all. But as we're thinking about this idea of collective well-being, as we're really thinking about engaging in activities and ways of being that benefit the whole group, the wider community, those things that give us social connection, those pieces and activities that give us a sense of purpose, that help to build up our self-esteem, that can help to really bolster up that resilience, we wanted to give you the analogy of sunflowers. And so this was new for me. Pop in the chat if you've heard this before, but sunflowers are really interconnected and they're constantly thinking about each other as they're growing. So sunflowers that are growing in a big patch, when their roots are coming down into the soil, they will actually grow their roots away from a rich patch of dense soil if another sunflower's roots are there. They're not trying to compete for those resources. They're actually saying, you take those resources. We're going to benefit as a whole group if I go over here and I plant my roots in this soil here. And so they also, when they're growing densely together, cast shadows on one another, but they have an interconnected system where they will literally start to move so that a sunflower that isn't getting enough sun gets the light that it needs. And they do this constantly in motion where, again, they are not competing for the same resources. They are coming together and they are really thinking about that collective well-being of the entire patch. And so our sort of call to action today is really to think about how we can all be more like sunflowers, how we can come together. I think when things get really stressful, sometimes it feels like we need to compete for resources. There's so little, but we can and think about our sunflowers and think about how powerful we are, how much better we're all going to feel, and how much more we are all going to be supported if we can focus on that collective well-being.
Oh, Julia, I loved sunflowers before and I love them even more now. I just feel inspired by the sunflowers.
Amazing. I hope that we all see sunflowers coming along and are really thinking about them.
One of the sort of, this isn't in the script or the slides, but one of the wellness tips, right, is this how nature can be so, in some places they prescribe getting out in nature. It's amazing. So, sunflowers are a piece of nature. So how do we do this? We have some tips here for how do we create like this community care concept, right? It's a great idea. We know that connections with other people are healing and are sometimes the only thing that can get us through. I mean, I'm thinking about my relationships with the folks here, and when they lift me up and when they give me a compliment, I'm like, oh, okay, that's so meaningful. So some of the tips here that you can do to create your caring community and to be more like sunflowers, right? Check in with each other regularly. Ask folks, how are you doing? Now, in an ideal world, you would have these check-ins that are scheduled and that are routine so that people know they can count on that every week. That's not always possible, but just checking in with folks, letting them know, I'm thinking about you. I'm wondering how you're doing. I'm thinking about something you went through. Lets people feel that they're seen and heard, right? And that you're holding them in mind, which goes so long or so far in terms of creating this caring community. We're going to talk a lot about empathy. Empathy is a huge part of motivational interviewing. We don't always have to agree with each other to empathize with one another. In fact, you can be pretty sort of adamantly disagreeing with what someone says, but to connect with the experience of their struggle. Because we've all had struggles, right? Even if it's not the same struggle that you've had, you can connect with a person in terms of what they're going through, that they're going through something hard, right? And we've all gone through hard times. Socializing, planning to meet with people, that can fall by the wayside when things get rough. We tend to maybe isolate ourselves when things become challenging. And instead, reach out, connect, find the time to stay in relationship with each other, offer people specific help. Let me wipe the tables off for you. Let me do that errand for you. I brought you a coffee because I know how much you like coffee, right? What are those concrete things that we can do for each other? And rest, like more and more research is coming out. I see people nodding, right? How do we prioritize? Sometimes you just have to take a pause and encourage that good sleep hygiene and that good rest. The other bullet here is sometimes conversations don't go so well, and sometimes people say things and do things and we see it. And so letting somebody know, hey, how did that conversation land with you? Like, I saw that. Like, I'm wondering, are you okay? Like, do you want to talk about it? And that can go a long way. So why don't we go to the next slide? And so we know what children need, right? We're really, really clear on children need caring, sensitive, nurturing, responsive relationships. It is hard to provide those relationships when we're not doing well ourselves. And when we're doing better, we can be our best self and provide children with the best care possible. And so we hope these strategies we're not teaching you motivational interviewing, but we're really borrowing from those conversational strategies. And we hope you can use them in coaching to support teachers' well-being, to support interventionist well-being so that they can be their best selves with children and families. So what is it? So I'm going to go over these next number of slides kind of quickly because we did another webinar a while back, maybe a year or so ago, that's recorded, that's on the NCPMI website. So please go to that. I am going to go through these, so it might be review if you've seen that webinar, but it will be helpful for us all to be on the same page. But if you want more, I encourage you to please go back and look at the recording. But here I just want to say sometimes motivational interviewing has a bad rap. I think, when you hear the words, sometimes people think it's trying to convince somebody to do something. And in fact, it's really sort of the opposite in a way, that what we're really trying to do is enhance our relationship with someone. And if we go to the next slide, we can see that what's at the heart of motivational interviewing is really building that trusting mutual relationship. And I think mutual is key here, because so often we, whether we're a coach, whether we're an interventionist, whether we're a teacher, whether we're a supervisor, we often are in sort of a hierarchical position. And so motivational interviewing encourages us to try to reduce that hierarchy and be in sort of equal relationship with someone. And if we go to the next slide.
Hey, Amy.
Yeah.
Sorry. So we had a question and it kind of feels like it fits in right here. So I'm going to just kind of pose it. But someone's asking about what if people don't want, like when Julia was talking about community care, what if someone doesn't want help, or people take it as you're doubting them versus just reaching out for support? Are you going to talk? Is that going to kind of fit in right here?
I think we have a little scenario that kind
Oh.
of relates to that a little bit, but I think one of the first things I don't know if this is like going to take us off in a tangent, but I'm going to do it anyway. So sometimes when I hear questions like that, my immediate response is a little bit overwhelming. Like, oh, like that's so hard. And so I know we're going to talk about that. Is one of the first strategies you want to do is tune into yourself, right? To, when someone, for whatever reason, right? And whether it's overt or sort of more subtle, just does not want to engage, is to really tune into what that is like for you, right? And so even hearing this question, like a couple steps removed, I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't. And so, making sure that you don't take that personally, right? And that you sort of regulate yourself, and that and we're going to talk a lot about, this is foreshadowing, but leaning into like trying to understand what that's about. Just like we understand children's behavior has meaning, we want to understand what that adult's behavior is trying to tell us. And we have some strategies for trying to understand that. Does that help? So
and
yeah,
we'll just come back to it when you get to the scenario. So thanks.
okay. I'm conscious of moving too fast and too slow here, but we're going to go over most of these things, I think. So I'm not going to spend too much time here other than to highlight one of the things we really want to think about with MI is that we're exploring the other person's, just like I was just saying, their interests, their values, their expertise, essentially what's motivating them to exhibit the behavior that they're exhibiting, right? And we want to explore their uncertainty, right? No matter what change you're going to make, whether it's like, I want to buy a new pair of shoes, to like something really significant in your life, there's always sort of pros and cons and some ambivalence related to that. And so we want to really lean into that. But we're really going to highlight some of these as we go forward. So here's some key principles of MI. We have a handout that really maps all of this out, just like here on the slides. We already talked about expressing empathy. And this relates, I think, to your question, ML, too, about supporting self-efficacy. So ultimately, it is the person's decision. I think we sometimes get really caught up in, oh my gosh, if I can't help this person to engage in a coaching relationship, I must be a bad coach, or like I should have all the answers, or if, they don't want to engage, it must be something that I'm doing, right? And ultimately, it's the person's decision as to what they want to do, whether they want to engage in coaching, whether they want to make a change, whether they don't want to talk to you, right? The more we support their autonomy, the better we are in the relationship. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this idea of leaning into resistance and developing some discrepancies around. Sometimes people say they want to change, but their actions or their talk isn't quite in alignment with the fact that they want to change. And so we just illuminate that a little bit. And so we can go to the next. And so here's some ways that we do that, some actual strategies. We ask a lot of open-ended questions. What, where, how, when? Tell me about it. What's that experience like for you? How is it landing? Right? All those really opening questions. Any question that's not a yes, no answer. We are strength-based. This is where we find what is going well. Right? If someone is still showing up to teach every day, I might say, I am so impressed that given how hard this is, you keep coming back to work every single day. Same, I used to say this a lot in my clinical practice. Sometimes people would tell me stories and I just would be floored on what I heard. And so I was like, I can't believe how well you've been doing given what you're sharing. Right. And then we're listening. You know, we all would say, I think, that we're really good listeners. And in fact, the research says we're not very good listeners, right? So when people have been videotaped and they've rated themselves as, yes, I'm an excellent listener, that's my job, it turns out actually maybe not so much. So it's hard to be present. So I would offer you to just pay attention on how present you are when you're with someone. Are you fully listening with your ears, with your sight? You're observing their body language. You're not thinking about the 20 other things that you need to do, but you're really just grounded in hearing what someone is saying with their words and with their body. And then checking in. Do I have this right? Did I get it? This is what I heard you say, but I wonder if I missed something. I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. Correct me if I'm wrong, right? These are the things to help you check to see if you got it. We can go to the next. And so we talked about sort of the spirit of it and the skills of it, and this is the process. So in any given conversation, you might move through these sort of phases. They're very loosely, I would say, phases, but engaging. So we're always focused on developing that relationship. We're always building rapport. Then we're checking in with someone about the agenda. This is what I had on my agenda. I'm wondering what you brought today. Or I'm wondering if it would be okay if we talk about X, you know, so that you're both now on the same page about what the conversation is going to be like. And then you bring in the questions, those open-ended questions. How are you doing with the goal that we set last time? I wonder what that's like. I wonder, you know, how would it be different if you could wave a magic wand? That's a great question, right? What would it look like? So this is where you're really prompting and encouraging those reflection. And then you move into planning. So what do you want to do? What small step do you want to take? What ideas do you have about how to move forward? Someone's asking about seeing the slides afterwards. I think they get the slides, right?
We've got some community care. Someone just popped them in for already. Look at this sunflower group going. Love it.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. And so then the next slide. So sometimes we get into conversations that feel like we're sort of in a wrestling match, right? Or that we're in battle, right? And I bet no coach on this call has ever not experienced resistance. Let me say that in a different way, more clear. I bet we've all experienced resistance at some point. And so when you are feeling like you're sort of not getting anywhere, right? You know, and whether, as we said earlier, that's kind of you're getting the cold shoulder and maybe just getting one-word answers, or you're getting the vibe that someone really doesn't want to talk with you, or whether they outright say like, no, thanks, you know, I'm not into it. Think about it more coming alongside someone. So in my mind, these are pictures of dancing, but I also have in my mind sort of taking the journey together where, you know, you might have you might be standing alongside someone moving forward versus, people need something to resist against. And if you don't have any resistance, then there's nothing to resist against, right? So if someone is saying, I'm not interested, I don't have time, it doesn't work, all of those kinds of things, you might lean in and say, yeah, I hear you. Tell me more about that. I'm interested. I want to learn more. Julia, I know you've had experience with some of this.
Absolutely. That is really resonating with me when we take away that resistance. And I was just thinking that so often when people are really hesitant to engage in coaching, that is kind of like the forefront, right? Like, I'm going to resist against this. And when we come in alongside, we really get to the reason behind the why, right? Like, we learn a little bit more. What is the why? Is it because you're feeling so stressed out? Is it because you've had a really bad coaching experience before? Is it because you're not feeling supported or validated or acknowledged in your program or in your place of work? And so you're feeling like this is punitive, or this is saying, oh, I'm not doing very well. And I already feel inside like I'm not doing well. And that's, creating an anxious cycle or something, a big emotional response. So I think that really coming alongside, asking those open-ended questions, validating, and then I was just thinking too, just showing up consistently, right? It might not be the first or second or third conversation. It might be the fourth or fifth or sixth before there is some opportunity to see room for change or to get a little bit more information. And I do think there's a lot of power in being consistent and being predictable and showing up in a relational, non-judgmental way that can feel really different for many people, or they might not have had that experience before. So I think that kind of speaks to so often coaches are walking into chaos, right? A lot of times, hopefully not always, but many times, you might have one idea of what is going to happen in this coaching relationship, or it may have been presented in one way. And when we get there, it can look really different, right? Or we may be walking into a situation where we're coming in as an additional support because there is a lot going on in that classroom or with that family. And so to think about motivational interviewing, we also want to really hold where are we starting with. And so we have kind of these 3 slides or 3 graphics here of going inward, going outward, and going together. And so I think it's so important for our own well-being as people who are in support roles to really stop and think and reflect and ground ourselves and check in with ourselves and think about, how am I doing? Am I really stressed? Am I walking into this coaching meeting and I'm feeling like, oh, I can't do another one today, or I have things happening in my personal life? Really thinking about how we are, noticing for ourselves across our coaching sessions what might be coming up for us, noticing when we might feel like, I really want to resist here. I know I should be dancing. Amy just told me I should be dancing, but man, I want to wrestle. I can see it so clearly. I can see what needs to shift, right? And how do we slow ourselves down or notice that or back ourselves up to say, what is the goal of this session right now? Is it me telling someone what to do, or is it me really partnering, going alongside, being with to support that person in understanding or thinking about what they want to change, right? That might not be my top priority. And it's about that relationship and that person coming to their own understanding of what it is that they want to shift. And then thinking about what might we need in those moments where hard conversations pop up? What do we need to do to regulate before we move on to our next coaching session? Sometimes we go through something really emotional and we have like 3 minutes and then we're jumping right to the next person. And so what's in our toolbox? What are our strategies? Who are our community that we can lean on to make sure that we're showing up in a regulated way? And then we think about going outward, our relationship with the person that we're coaching, thinking about again, all of the really great motivational interviewing strategies Amy just shared, but thinking about what is that person's experience? How am I holding empathy for that? How am I making sure that I'm seeing them as an individual right now and not just lumping it in like, oh yeah, I've worked with 5 other people who present in the same exact way, so you must present this way too, because it feels similar. How are we really slowing down, really thinking about this person in front of us and what their experience is? How are we thinking about how their histories may have impacted how they are showing up today, both in positive and strengths-based ways and in ways that might make it feel like I need to be a little defensive or I need to be a little protective? How are we understanding that? And then how are we thinking about others that might be impacted by similar issues? So is this just an individual issue? Is it a classroom issue? Is it something we've noticed sort of programmatically or across a program? How are we understanding that? And how do we think about what the scope of that problem is? All of that can be really helpful to support us as we engage in these conversations of motivational interviewing. And then we can start to think about what motivational interview strategies do I feel really confident with? Which are the ones that I feel really good right out of the bat using? How am I using those strategies to partner? Thinking about how we start to connect to other programmatic support. So if people are really, obviously we're talking about wellness today too, if people are struggling with that, we don't want you to be holding that by yourself either. How are we thinking about other supports that are in place? How are we thinking about really growing that community of care? Who's part of our squad? Who's part of our community? And then how are we thinking about how we're setting goals that feel really manageable, that feel doable, especially in this climate where people are feeling extremely stressed? So we have a common coaching scenario here, and I'm curious, please share in the chat if you've run into something like this. But the scenario we have is that you're a coach and you're observing a teacher, and the teacher is using pyramid model practices in the classroom, and things are actually going pretty well, right? They're using the practices in the right way. We're seeing things shifting. You can see the practices, you can see the intentionality behind it, but it feels like there's something a little bit missing. So I see the practice, but I'm not leaving feeling like, yes, I feel joyful, I feel connected, I feel in relationship, I can feel like the joy emanating or the warmth emanating. Sometimes we call this that teachers might feel a little empty, like you're doing the right thing, you're saying the right thing, but there's no sort of warmth or authenticity or joy or excitement behind it. And we can feel that when we walk in, right? And that impacts how that practice is going to land with the co-teacher, with the children, with the families. So I'm curious if people have felt that way before. I think this is a scenario that we are running into quite a bit more recently as teachers are feeling more stressed, and it can feel really hard to think about how do we address this, because it can feel really personal. Like, I don't want to go up and be like, you know what, Amy, you did a great job today and you feel really cold. Could you just warm it up a little bit? Like, that doesn't feel good, right? That feels like a personal like attack or like something about a personality. And so it can be really hard to have these conversations. And oftentimes we just don't have the conversation, or we go in with best intentions, and sometimes it gets really messy or it doesn't land well. And that's where we want to think about using some of our motivational interviewing strategies. So things like
Hey, Julia, I'm sorry. Can I just interrupt you a second?
Yes.
This is such a perfect time. So someone asked how MI fits with PBC, and this is like practice-based coaching, if people don't know. And this is such a good example. Like the scenario you just gave is you've gone in to do the interview and the teacher's doing the things that you've talked about, and yet there's something missing. What do you do, right? And so I think this is a good example of how having motivational interviewing strategies in your toolbox just makes you better at being a good coach who's using PBC, right? Would you say that? Would you agree?
Yes, absolutely. I love that. And it really gets at the wellness-based practices too. We want to be feeling good. We want to feel joy and emotion, and we want to feel connected, right, across the day. And so for so many teachers, that means being connected in your classroom. You are connecting with those children, with your co-teacher, and with families, right, across the day. And so when we're missing that, oftentimes that feels really draining for us too. So some strategies that I love: open-ended questions, right? What does it feel like walking into your classroom every morning? Right? Has anyone ever asked you that? Where are those places in the day that you find joy? Where do you find yourself smiling? Where do you find yourself feeling excited to be in your classroom? Where are the places across the day that feel draining, that feel exhausting, right? We can get at a lot of really great information and help to start that reflective practice through motivational interviewing strategies, just through open-ended questions, right? Simple questions. And people might say, I don't know. That's really great information too, right? Maybe we haven't thought about it. Maybe everything's feeling so overwhelming we can't even think about it. I think that's really where reflective listening comes in too, when people do start to open up, really thinking about giving that space, slowing down. Are we really listening for understanding? Are we summarizing what we're hearing? Are we providing plenty of those positive affirmations, right? Are we validating, yes, this is so hard and it feels hard because it is hard, right? Are we doing that consistently? Are we doing that so that this person is coming and feeling comfortable and supported, and we're shifting away from judgment? Because we know that most people in this field are here for a reason, because they love it and they're really hard on themselves and they're really high achievers, and it can be very easy to start to come inward and attack yourself versus thinking about, I can be curious about this. I don't need to judge myself. Let's just be curious. Let's think about what's happening here. And that can help to, again, make inroads for what we do next, or have opportunities to reflect on change. Amy, I know you had a little scenario that's really stuck with me, a story that you shared with me just about the power of something as simple as reflective listening can have. I say it's simple, but I think it is harder to do in practice. And I was wondering if you might share that here.
I was totally looking at the chat. I'm sorry. Say that one more time.
Sorry, just putting you on the spot. You had shared a really great story about the power of just reflective listening and validating. And I was hoping you might be able to share that with the group too.
I think I know the story that you're talking about. So I don't know if this word will ring a bell for anyone on this call or on this webinar, but it stays with me because of this story. So many, many years ago, I was doing a training on this very topic, motivational interviewing, and it happened to be in the time of, this is the word, sequestration. Does that ring a bell? It's sort of relevant now. It was a time when Head Start programs had to cut. The budgets were being cut, and Head Start leaders were really faced with some incredibly difficult decisions about needing to cut staff. I mean, it was horrible. It was really hard for Head Start leaders and Head Start programs. And so here I was doing a training on motivational interviewing, and I'm talking about what the topic is. And one of the Head Start directors said, well, gee, I thought you were going to tell me how I was going to cut and who I needed to cut. And, this is not going to help. And and I'm like, oh my God. How in the world am I going to help this director with this incredibly challenging problem? And so I said, well, that's not really what this was going to be about, but you might find some useful tools, as we go through. And if, you're welcome to stay, and, maybe we could talk at break. So she stayed, and then at lunch, she came up to me. It was a whole day thing. And so the lunch was in the middle of it. And she started talking about her particular problem. And she said, I have to cut staff. Staff is like family, I don't know how to do it. And I've been up nights thinking about how to do this. I have solution A, I have solution B, I have scenario Z, I have, I've gone through. And as I'm listening to her, was so overwhelmed and so thinking, like, how could I possibly help in this like grave situation? But I thought about what I was training on, which was motivational interviewing. And I said to myself, just listen, be present, listen. And I promise you, I said very little, but I did listen with all I had. And I maybe said a few affirmations like, gosh, this sounds like a really tough situation. And it sounds like I just summarized, been up nights thinking about this, and you've put your all into it. anyway, it was quite a long, quite heated, very emotional conversation. And I truly just listened. And in the end of the conversation, she said, "Oh my gosh, thank you so much. You helped me so much." And I said barely anything. But what happened was she was able to hear herself, and she had the answers, right? She had more answers than any quote unquote expert could ever come up with. But she needed someone to be present to witness her talking it through, right? And to having those answers.
I love that so much, Amy. That's really stuck with me. And I think sometimes we can fly over reflective listening, like, well, what's that even going to do? And I think this is such a great example of how powerful that skill is and how it can be such a good one for us to lean into when we're feeling overwhelmed too. How do I stay present? How do I stay connected? How am I really, truly listening? I think too, we can think about this discrepancy, developing discrepancy, and that can be really helpful to start to help whoever we are coaching to recognize that difference of where their current behavior is and does that line up with the goals they have for the future. So we have a little sample here. On one hand, you've had so many challenges this year and your stress level is through the roof. And on the other hand, you're telling me you don't feel ready to focus on wellness or well-being goals during our coaching time together. So again, it's just summarizing, like Amy said, what might be happening in that conversation. And the idea is that hopefully the coachee is able to start to say, those two things might not align. I actually do want to feel better. I do want to feel well in the future. What do I need to be? How am I starting to integrate some of these well-being or wellness-based goals into our time together? All right, we have another scenario that, Amy's going to go over this. This is great. I love a good confidence ruler.
So just a real quick strategy that you might want to use in your conversations. I do love this strategy. So you would say on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you that things could get better? Or on a scale of 1 to 10, how willing are you to try this new strategy, or whatever the question may be, you're asking them to scale it. And whatever they say, like maybe they say, what would be typical is if someone's feeling really down, they might say like a 2, 3, 4, something like that. Your natural inclination would be to say, why don't you feel a 10 about that? But what I want you to say is, why don't you feel 1 or 0 about that? I want you to go down, because what will happen is the person will start telling you why they have a little bit of hope left, right? Why they have a little bit of optimism about, well, I think things could get better because, and there you go, right? There you have your way in to start to build upon that last little bit of hope that they have inside, and their last, things that maybe they haven't tried everything, or maybe they could hang in there a little bit more. And so just a reminder here that we live in a very fast-paced society and we all want a quick fix, right? And so sometimes we have to slow down. I'm noticing my voice even slowing down to go further, right? And that, going deeper might get us, or really, it's not about us, but getting someone in a place to go where they want to go a little bit further if we're slowing down and not trying to rush the process. And we have just about 10 more minutes, but I do want to highlight a couple pieces from a scenario related to early intervention. And so this scenario I'll just read it to you. Chase is a new early intervention provider. He has shared a few situations with a similar theme. He arrives at the family's house for a session, and as soon as he gets there, the child's parent leaves the room to go to a different part of the house, to do dishes or rest. And he's not sure about how to talk with families about this, them not being engaged. So let's see, if we use motivational interviewing strategies, I'm going to use it as a parallel process, right? So as a coach, how would you use these strategies with the interventionist? And then in a second, we'll look at how the interventionist might use some of these strategies with the family. So in this case, you might ask these open-ended questions. What have you tried before? What's worked in the past? Have you faced this problem before? You might hold this ambivalence, as we talked about before, this uncertainty around what would happen if you don't say anything? Would it just change on its own? What would happen if you do say something? What are you worried about if you say something? What are you worried about if you don't say something? And then moving through sort of the process to get to the planning phase of, would you like to role play that right now? And so I'm giving the interventionist some authority around how it would go in our session together. Like, do you want to practice it? What would be helpful for us to talk about how you make a decision around where to go next with this family? And so then if we switch and think about how the interventionist, I think his name was Chase, might use some of these strategies with the family, he might start by thinking about always keeping in mind the building rapport and the relationship. Like, that is the most important thing. And he might go in with some strengths, right? I appreciate that you're always here when I come, right? The parent is there. They may leave, but they've made time for the appointment every time. I know you have a lot going on, so recognizing that you might ask an evocative question or reflective question. How do you think these visits are going? Let me go to the next slide. And then Julia gave an example previously about this idea of developing discrepancy. If the person maybe says something about, well, I think they're going fine, but I just have too much to do, or I'm just too tired, or, whatever it might be. And you can validate, like, you've got a lot going on, as most parents do, right? It sounds like you're kind of frustrated because on the one hand, you really want to make changes in your son's life. You really want your son to make progress. On the other hand, you're exhausted. You're so busy. Like, you're not sure how you can fit one more thing in. How do you see these meetings fitting in with your goals? And then, so using some of the other skills, some other questions that you might offer, you might do this validating. That makes tremendous sense. How could we make these more useful to you? What could we change? What would make it easier? Right? What changes do you feel ready to make? Would it make sense to be part of it for a little bit of the time? What makes sense to you? How about we try something? We could try it as an experiment, see if it works, and you let me know. And then planning, is this still me, Julia, or is this you? I feel like this.
You keep going, Amy. You got
No, you're the planner. You are on. Bring it home.
Right. Well, so as we think about planning, we know that I always say, like, let's set a small goal. Let's make it smaller. No, smaller, right? Because we know that as we're thinking about that planning piece, that we really want to be able to find some success. We want to be set up for success. We want to be thinking about, is this something doable? And then we get curious about it if it doesn't go through, right? So we might ask questions like, how do you know if it feels helpful? What might get in the way of me joining? Like, I really wanted to join today, but man, I have to get this thing done, or I have to pop onto this meeting, or I'm just so exhausted. I just don't feel like I can show up as myself today. How does that inform some of the open-ended questions we might ask next time, or what we might set up for our plan to be next time? So we can think about that, the planning piece. Do we have enough structure? Do we have that accountability? Does the family know, like, okay, I thought our plan was you were going to join with us in the beginning. Maybe they were like, I wasn't sure if I was doing that this week or not. How are we making sure we're really clear on that? How are we reviewing the plan? How do we have that really good validation and intrinsic reward to be like, did you see Chase's, or I forget the boy's name. Chase's intervention.
Doesn't have a name.
Did you see his face when you joined? That's the biggest smile I've seen on his face ever. He was delighted you were here, and you had a smile on your face too, right? How are we really thinking about that descriptive feedback to be that reward, to make sure that it's feeling really good to keep joining in? So we know that these kinds of conversations have a huge impact on our relationships. We also know that relationships are the #1 strategy to support well-being for us. Being connected, being in relationship, having the support of other people, right? Especially when we're stressed or we're having a difficult time, relationships are where it's at. And we're really saying that motivational interviewing can help us to deepen those relationships. It can help us to slow down in those moments of chaos where we are feeling overwhelmed. We know that whoever we're coaching is feeling overwhelmed. It can be like a reprieve or a breath of fresh air to say, I've got you. We can do this at your pace. I know it feels like everything is crumbling around you, but right now in this time, we get to choose what that looks like, what that feels like, how we do it together. And of course, we want to hold our sunflowers. So we want you all to be thinking about who's in your sunflower field, who's part of your community of care, your squad that really shows up for you, and how do we continue to think about how we do this within our coaching work, within our programs, and for our families as well. And last but not least, we have a few reflective questions here for you all just to be able to take and think about and use. You can think about your comfort level on some of these pieces. You can think about some of your patterns of behavior or what shows up for you. Where do you feel super comfortable? Where do you notice yourself maybe shying away a little bit? And thinking about how motivational interviewing might be able to support some of those conversations and going deeper, or even being able to start those conversations. And last but not least, we want to make sure you all are taking care of yourselves too. We know that in order to do this really deep relational work, we have to start with someone who's regulated. And so often when we are walking into coaching situations, that's us. We need to be the ones who are regulated and who are showing up and have that capacity to support and connect and go deeper. And so we know in order to do that, we have to be taking care of ourselves too. And hopefully you are finding your squad even across this webinar in the chat. I'm already seeing it, which is so beautiful.
Julia and Amy, thank y'all so much. I don't know about anybody else, but like I just feel a little bit lighter after listening to y'all talk about this, after thinking about the sunflower, and it's a heavy time in some ways, and this was just really, really helpful. So thank y'all so much.
Thank you so very much to our panelists for their wonderful insights. Your feedback is very important to the work that we do. Please remember to provide your feedback on this webinar with our post-webinar survey by typing the web address shown on this slide into your internet browser. Your certificate of attendance will appear once you submit the survey. We invite you to visit our website, challengingbehavior.org, to sign up for our upcoming webinars, access recordings, download pyramid model resources, and more. Thank you to our funder for making this webinar possible. This concludes our webinar. Thank you all and have a great rest of your day.